In this video, we're talking about an absolutely insane PS5 hack, how the PS5 is going back to 2004, and how we have the first great game of 2024. How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne, and this is PSReady, the channel all about PlayStation, and right now it's about the PlayStation 5. So if that sounds good to you, make sure you let me know by subscribing and setting your notifications to all. This weekend, I sunk so many more hours into Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, and I got to the point in the story where it's like, go beat the dragon, which is the end of the game, and I just didn't want it to end, so I spent some time filling out the map, doing some dungeons, clearing out some side quests, and now I have like nothing left to do, and I'm kind of bummed about it because it's one of those games that's just like so good that it never gets boring. Even if you mainline the story and do a few side quests, nothing too crazy, it's only going to take you around 25 or 30 hours to get through. So if you're looking for a great game to play in the meantime while we wait for some of these bigger games like Dragon's Dogma 2 or Rise of the Ronin or Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, you've got to try this game. You can get it so cheap now. You can get like a used PS4 disc that comes along with the Dark Arisen DLC, and man, it is so worth it. I'm telling you, go play Dragon's Dogma as soon as you can. So the first thing I want to talk about is the PlayStation 5 hack. This went super quick. Like once it was discovered, they got really far in it super quickly, and now the main thing that people are using their PlayStation 5 hacked version for is running older games at a full locked 60 FPS. And Digital Foundry, one of the best channels on YouTube, they went through a few games that are improved massively by hacking your PlayStation 5 and unlocking the frame rate, because for certain games like Ghost of Tsushima, The Last of Us Part 2, I think Horizon Zero Dawn, and a few others like Days Gone, Sony did patches on those games where they said, hey, developers, patch them, clean them up a little bit, and get them all running at a locked 60 FPS. And I've talked about all of those games and how much better they are running at that frame rate. And I like when Sony does that because for me, last generation for sure, a lot of the games that would come out, my big choice between playing them on PS5 or PC was how good the PC port was, because if it didn't have stutter or any of those weird issues that have been cropping up for the past few years or so, the experience was legitimately better because you could play games at 60 FPS. And like once you see 60 FPS, you can't really go back. So for games like Ghost of Tsushima, The Last of Us, all the other ones I just mentioned, those were no-brainer purchases on the PlayStation 5 if I hadn't played them on PS4, because they could run at 60 FPS. And when you played them on PS5, it wasn't this like weird performance mode we've been getting lately that's like 50 to 60. It was a hard locked 60 FPS, and it was an incredible experience playing through all of these games. Like I'm so glad I waited to play Days Gone until I got to the PS5. No, I didn't. I played it on PS4 Pro, and then I played it again on PS5, and I played it again on PC. That's one of my favorite games ever. That was a bad example, but yeah, playing these games for the first time at 60 on a PS5, just on my TV with my great soundbar, that was like the ultimate PS5 experience. But there are a ton of other games that I used to love on the PlayStation 4 that never came to PC that I've always wanted to get one of these patches that never have. The games Digital Foundry tested are Red Dead Redemption 2, Drive Club, and Batman Arkham Knight, and those are three of the coolest games ever. If you've never played Drive Club, it honestly didn't really get a fair shake just because of Sony's marketing. So back in the day, Sony actually had three racing game studios. There was Studio Liverpool, who did the Wipeout series. There was Polyphony Digital, of course, and I'll never forget Polyphony Digital's name because I went to the Podcast Beyond 300 episode, and one of the like trivia questions I got called up to answer was name Sony's racing studios, and I would have gotten a PS4 from Colin, who runs Sacred Symbols now, and I just balked on Polyphony Digital, so I'll never forget their name. And then there was this third studio, Evolution Games, who had the MotorStorm series, and I loved MotorStorm because back when the PS3 was coming out, they had demo kiosks at Target, and one of the games they had was MotorStorm. And when my mom would go to Target, I would just stand there. I was that annoying kid who would just replay the demo for MotorStorm over and over again. And then when my friend Matt got a PS3 before me, I went to his house to play MotorStorm. I went and bought a used copy at GameStop, and I brought it over to his house, and I had a profile on his PS3 so I could play MotorStorm. And then MotorStorm Pacific Rift was awesome. MotorStorm Arctic Edge on the PSP was also incredible. But the third game, MotorStorm Apocalypse, the release timing of it lined up really badly with, I think, like a monsoon or something in Japan, and they didn't want to release it because it was called MotorStorm Apocalypse, and you drove through like cities that were falling apart. So when they eventually released it, they didn't market it, the game didn't do well, and then their next game, Drive Club, had a lot of delays, and it came out around the same time as a Gran Turismo game, and because of that, no one really gave it a fair shake, but it was awesome. It had some of the best, and still does have some of the best racing game graphics I've ever seen. It did a lot with weather. It had a more arcadey feel to it. And then unfortunately, it didn't really set the world on fire. And then Sony shut that studio down, and then Codemasters bought them, and they made a game called Onrush, which again was like MotorStorm mixed with Burnout. And it was such an awesome game, but it had a really bad release time and no one played it. I think it came out on like the same day or within a couple of weeks of Monster Hunter World. And Monster Hunter World is Capcom's best-selling game ever. So obviously people weren't catching on to Onrush because, you know, a racing game is never going to do as well as a big AAA third-person action game. But Drive Club is really good. It was one of the first games on PS4 that they just gave away at launch on PS Plus, and I loved it. But the big problem was the fact that it ran at 30 FPS, because when you're playing racing games, like I have a Steam Deck, I love racing games, I play everything. I'm addicted to like Need for Speed Heat, I love Need for Speed Unbound, Burnout Paradise Remastered is another game I'm playing through right now. I have the Crew Motorfest over on my PC and my PS5, and it save transfers and everything. Like I play a lot of racing games. That is the one type of game outside of fighting games that you absolutely need to run at 60 FPS. So having Drive Club run at 30 kind of also took away from it, and they never patched it to run at 60 FPS on the PS4 Pro or eventually, you know, the PlayStation 5. So to see it running at 60 FPS on a PS5 is absolutely insane. And what I really hope happens is Sony sees how cool this is and kind of just goes back and just pushes out a little patch, right? Like if you can do it this easily on a hacked PS5 by just unlocking the frame rate, and then the console will have VSync on so it'll run at a lock 60, there's no reason why Sony can't push out a patch for these and make them work. Red Dead Redemption 2 is another one that just doesn't make sense to me, because I played it on my Xbox One X because it had better graphics than the PS4 Pro back in the day, and it was still cool. But like if you look at the PC settings Red Dead uses on the PS4 and Xbox One, it uses like mostly low settings, and the like draw distance and everything is turned down a lot. So when it came out on PC, it was kind of a buggy port, but I powered through and it was a lock 60 across the board, and it was awesome. So we heard rumors that Rockstar was going back and doing a patch or a remastered version that they could re-release on the PlayStation 5, and for some reason they just stopped working on it in favor of GTA 6. And this is another game that, seeing it running at 60, you can't go back. So once I played it on the PC, I wanted to go back and finish my save that I had on the Xbox, and I just couldn't do it because it's so slow at 30 FPS, and that game's animations are already a little bit heavy and slow to begin with. So once you play it at 60, again, it's impossible to go back. And then the third game, Batman Arkham Knight, that's another one that just got abandoned for no reason, and it's another one that has a really crappy PC port. We talk about this a lot with Dead Space, where you'll never be able to like out hardware the problems Dead Space has on PC. Like when you're going between doors, it loads in the next part of the level and you'll get traversal stutter. It's there on PlayStation 5 for sure, but it is way worse on PC because of the way the CPU architecture works on PC, which is why you'll have to wait like 10 years for a CPU to get good enough where that micro stutter will still be there, but the CPU will basically be able to brute force its way through it. So you'll just get a 1 frame stutter instead of like a 15 frame stutter. Arkham Knight is the exact same kind of game where the PC port was so bad that WB actually removed it from Steam. So I bought it on PS4 and it was a good experience on PS4, right? Like Rocksteady was awesome with Unreal Engine 3 back in the day, and it ran at a really like hard lock 30 FPS. But now on PC, still, even with my 4090 equipped machine, playing it at 60, you still get traversal micro stutter because of the way it was. So to see that one also running at 60 FPS, I don't know why WB doesn't just patch that. Like when Gotham Knights was coming out, I'm sure the reason they didn't want to patch it was because everyone would have just gone back and played Arkham Knight at 60 instead of Gotham Knights, and like fair, I get that. But now with Suicide Squad coming out, knowing that it's a direct sequel to Arkham Knight, like it takes place in the same universe, uses the same Batman, and all the characters are from that game, there's like a no better time for WB to just add the patch in that lets it run at least 60 or even an unlocked frame rate, because there's no way that game could just not run at 60, because we're seeing it running at 60. But this is something that I'd honestly pay $5 or $10 for. And once again, just like with themes and every other thing we want from the PlayStation 5, it's getting really annoying to see hackers doing what people want before Sony does. So I want to see them making great moves like they did in the PS3 generation when they weren't on top. Like they used to be really generous with free games on PS Plus and everything else down the line. Next up here, we got to talk about sales figures, but in a more interesting way, because I hate just listing numbers. numbers, it kind of ties into that news story we talked about, I think a couple of weeks ago, where analysts are kind of attacking Sony and saying, hey, we want to make money off of PlayStation, right? And when you make a console like the PlayStation 5 or the upcoming PS5 Pro, where unlike the PS4, they have a lot of graphics headroom still to work with, like you can still get games running 60 on them over 3 years into the life cycle, all that does is encourage developers to use that extra headroom, and what that does is totally inflate the budget of games. Of course, we have Insomniac to mention because of the Insomniac leak. Spider-Man 2 is one of the most expensive games ever at $300 million, and the big argument a lot of analysts, and honestly a lot of players too, have against games like this is when you put that much more money into the game, like you double the budget from Spider-Man 2018 or Spider-Man Remastered for Spider-Man 2, you get diminishing returns almost immediately, and a lot of people don't really notice that extra budget going into the game. So what analysts are saying is, like, you made Ghost of Tsushima on an $80 million budget and it goes toe to toe with games like The Last of Us Part 2 and Spider-Man 2, so you should artificially limit the PS6 because you're never going to sell enough PS5s to get the actual install base you need where people are showing up to buy first party games and actually making money on these things. Like, you're spending so much money on games that you'll never be able to recoup it. So this data is coming from Weekly Famitsu, which is like a magazine in Japan, and it's been around forever. It's super reliable, and what they're reporting is that, of course, in first place is the Nintendo Switch. It's like the best-selling console ever in Japan. But the real data here that I want to talk about is that the PS5 sold 2.58 million units in Japan, which is a huge increase over the 1.5 million units they sold last year, and that's the first time it outsold its record in Japan, which happened all the way back in 2004 with the PS2. For some reason, the PS3, PS4, and PSP, and of course the Vita, were never able to really catch on in Japan to the same level. So it is awesome to finally see a console that's performing well there, because traditionally everyone in Japan has just been buying Switch games or playing mobile games. And I'm thinking that, like, the games that kind of inspired people to maybe pick up a PlayStation 5 are stuff like Final Fantasy 16, because that of course is a Japanese game and it's like a high point series in Japan. So that makes a lot of sense. And of course, Yakuza, the Like a Dragon series, is also at its high point right now. So the PS5 in the past year has had a lot of experiences that make you go out and buy a PlayStation 5. And another reason this is good is because it shows that third-party exclusives work. I know there's a rumor out there going around right now that Final Fantasy 7 or Final Fantasy 16 could be coming to the Xbox Series X very soon, but Final Fantasy 7 coming there isn't really that big of a deal, because not only did it sell through its PS4 units, it also sold through its entirety of its integrated re-release units on the PlayStation 5, and it's been available on subscription services like PS Plus Extra, and you could just upgrade it for $10 to get the PS5 version, and that was a really good deal. And with Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth right around the corner, I'm really curious if that's going to move the needle even more for the PlayStation 5 in Japan. Like, the timing works out where people could have bought a PS5 for Christmas in Japan waiting for Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, but I feel like that 1-2 punch of Final Fantasy 16 in 2023 and then Rebirth in 2024 is just going to really push things over the edge. And my favorite new game to talk about, Dragon's Dogma 2, that's made by Capcom, who's in a complete renaissance right now where they're literally incapable of releasing a bad game. From all the gameplay I've seen of Dragon's Dogma 2, it looks like it's going to be an absolute 10. Of course, they also have Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak, Monster Hunter World. Like, they're on a total upswing. So having that 1-3 punch of Final Fantasy 16, Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, and then Dragon's Dogma 2, like, man, this is going to be a good year for the PlayStation 5, I think, around the world. So yeah, it is nice to see the console selling better in Japan, because while I do think game budgets need to be brought down overall, I think the philosophy of, not making the PS6 great on purpose is not really going to work in the long run. And all that's really going to do is set them up even better to release a PS6 Pro, maybe even sooner, like 2 years into the life cycle of the PS6. And if that's the console that they were going to launch with in the first place, I think that's a really crappy scenario. And the third news story I have for you guys today is that the big releases are not slowing down, because we already have an early Game of the Year contender with Prince of Persia. So I know when this game was announced, people weren't happy about it because it's a side-scrolling Metroidvania style game that's basically like if Ubisoft made their own version of Metroid Dread. And then the other controversial choice is that you actually don't play as the Prince of Persia in this game, which, like, I don't really have a horse in this race. That's the one huge blind spot for me when it comes to gaming. Like, I got into Ubisoft games with Far Cry 3 and Assassin's Creed 2. So not only did I miss the first Assassin's Assassin's Creed, I missed the preceding series, which was Prince of Persia. And I know people loved those games when I was growing up. It was just like I had limited resources, money, and I wanted to play other games, so that's what I played, and that's why it's a huge blind spot for me. So having the prince not be the main character and sort of be the victim, I guess, like you're rescuing the prince in this game, that doesn't really bother me. And for me, I'm a huge Metroidvania fan. I started getting into them a lot when I was playing games like Dead Cells, which is one of my favorite games of all time, and then of course games like The Messenger, which starts as like a side-scrolling Ninja Gaiden game and then becomes a Metroidvania at the halfway point. And then of course you have things like Metroid Dread, Metroid 2, Metroid Samus Returns, the 3DS one that was a remake of Metroid 2. And then I went and played the Castlevania Advance Collection, which was an awesome experience back in the day. So I'm a huge fan of Metroidvania games, and this one looks like a game that you have to play on day one. Unfortunately, it's got the $10 price increase, even though it's like a budget game. Like it would have only been $40 in the PS4 generation, but now it's $50 because everything got raised $10. But if you look at the reviews, it's getting not only like across the board 9s, it's even getting a lot of 10s, and people are saying that it runs incredibly. Like on PS5, it runs at 4K 120 FPS, and it's a perfect lock. The combat is super fluid. My friend Jake Baldino in his Before You Buy video said that the controls are like buttery smooth, and the only gripes he had were that the story isn't really that good, which like who cares in a Metroidvania, and that you get abilities early on that you just use throughout the entire game. So you have these like mappable abilities, and like they just like don't get better than the ones you get at the beginning, I guess. But if those are the only two gripes that he has, like, man, this must be an absolutely incredible experience from top to bottom. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you today. I also wanted to shout out my horror channel. I just put up a video about Friday the 13th in 2024. It looks like we're not only getting a new TV show, but we're also going to get a new movie and a game. Those might slip to 2025, but I'm pretty sure the Crystal Lake show is coming out in 2024. I also have a video queued up about Halloween because we heard that Halloween is coming back very soon with a TV show and a movie, which, you know, that's my favorite franchise ever. And then the third thing that's coming out is, of course, a new Nightmare on Elm Street that has been in the works for a while now. So if you want to keep up to date on some slasher franchises, head over to my other channel, which is called Jimmy Champagne.